Seven-year-old Zane Gbangbola was killed by poisonous gas while he slept in his bed in his Surrey home one night. His father was left paralysed from the waist down. The evidence shows hydrogen cyanide was responsible. The authorities deny it leaked from a former landfill site adjacent to the family home. 9 years on, and Zane's parents are still campaigning for a public inquiry. I'm journalist Angela Walker, and in this podcast I talk to inspirational people and discuss underreported issues. My guests today are Keir Gbangbola and Nicole Lawler, Zane's parents. Thank you both so much for joining me. I'm a parent and I can only imagine what you've been through, so thank you for sharing your story about Zane with us today. Can we go back to February 2014? There was widespread flooding across Surrey. It was getting worse. What was happening where you were in Chertsey?
So much like the rest of the country, Chertsey was flooded and the surrounding area was flooded. And people were defending their homes as best as possible. And that is usually in this area by the mechanism of pumping, because we have in our Victorian houses a flood basement, and our house is all electric, so our pumps were all electric pumps.
Talk me through when you first realised there was something seriously wrong in your own home. What had happened there?
We had no clue that there was something seriously wrong because the nerve agent is invisible and odourless, and effectively it destroyed us as soon as it got into the home. So the first we were aware was being in hospital, having Nicole found Zane collapsed, and she did her utmost to resuscitate Zane. But we wouldn't have known, because the gas was invisible and odourless, what had caused Zane to be unwell and to have collapsed. So Nicole was the person that alerted the emergency services. As a result, fortunately, she's a heroine, the whole area got evacuated, because when the emergency services arrived, they knew that the situation was pretty serious. I was unconscious. Nicole would have been screaming for me to help, but this gas had already removed me from the scene. I was in cardiac arrest and knew nothing about it.
It's horrifying. So Keir and Zane were taken to hospital. What happened after that?
Everyone was taken to hospital because, of course, Nicole was poisoned, but in her heroic effort, she was able to try and move around. And when we got to hospital, they continued, air ambulance came as well. They continued to try and revive Zane and myself in resus.
And obviously they ran many tests in hospital. What did those tests indicate?
Hydrogen cyanide poisoning in our blood.
And the emergency services, they came to the whole parade of houses, to the terrace of houses, and I'm sure that they evacuated all the neighbours. Tell me about that emergency procedure that took place then.
So our understanding is that there is a protocol in the case of events and acts of terrorism, etc. So the people that arrived at our home were called hazmat, and they're the same people that would have arrived at, say, Parliament. They're specialists. And as soon as they had the detections of hydrogen cyanide, they started to evacuate the area. The statements from neighbours read much as follows. We were contacted by emergency services, the police and fire brigade came round. alerted us that Zane had been taken to hospital, and made clear that hydrogen cyanide was detected. They were asked to write down their next of kin, because by the time somebody comes to evacuate them, they may no longer be alive. And that's why local people were entirely aware of the hydrogen cyanide, because hydrogen cyanide is a chemical weapon of mass destruction. It kills people within seconds, and that's why it was used in World War II gas chambers.
And tell me how this poisonous gas came into your house. How do you think it got in?
So we go by the evidence and the data, and what the reports stated is that the land came, the flood water came across land, and so the belief is that that is how the hydrogen cyanide came into the house. So it's a case of there's a source in an area, the flood water acts as a pathway, and then brings that gas to people and properties.
So the water doesn't come in through the doors and the windows. It comes up through the soil in the basement slowly as the water table rises. And it came across a landfill site, an historic landfill site that was never declared on anyone's searches. And even after Zane passed, the local authority said this land has never been a landfill site. Go away and stop creating hysteria. This was to the BBC. Then it's since subsequently been found out that it was an illegal, tip-in. It was a historic landfill site. It was condemned by the commandeered by the MOD during the Second World War, and they tested tanks and ammunitions on this land. None of it we ever knew. We thought our biggest risk was to get flooded. And you asked the question of what happened before. It was like a military operation. We had all of our belongings were upstairs or on bricks. The house was habitable, it was clean. Our biggest concern was whether the water would breach the habitable areas. And like I say, it was like a military operation, 24/7. We were monitoring, we had levels, we were taking the markers. We had electric pumps, and we were adding more electric pumps. You can't empty the basement when it's the water table, but we were dealing with, the panic of the flood.
So what Nicole's saying is that we ensured, using our electric pumps, that all habitable areas were dry, so we could utilise the house in the normal way.
Yeah.
And one thing you would need to know is that the hospitals were overwhelmed with unwell people. We discovered from the Freedom of Information papers, and that's important because it wasn't just us that were recipients and unwell. There were many others, to the point that it uses the words hospital overwhelmed with unwell people.
It's hard to believe, isn't it? You're in a flood situation, and I'm sure the last thing on your mind was worrying about a gas getting into the property. Now, you were obviously seriously injured, Kai. Tell me what the doctors said about your condition, because I know in their reports they named hydrogen cyanide.
So I had tests by specialists, and my diagnosis is very straightforward, and it says that I'm paraplegia due to hydrogen cyanide poisoning.
Let's talk about the inquest, if you don't mind. I know that in the inquest, they raised the issue of carbon monoxide. Now, that's something that you have always disputed, and I know that the evidence does not point to carbon monoxide. Can you talk me through that?
Yes, so the information from the FOI was that no carbon monoxide was found. So there's no carbon monoxide. So nobody can be injured or die from a substance that wasn't there. It confirmed also in the FOIs that hydrogen cyanide was detected multiple times. And the National Incident Record Book, which is a document written immediately that went from Portondown to Emergency Cobra on the day that Zane was killed, only talks about hydrogen cyanide. So the whole matter of carbon monoxide is a misdirection.
Now, there was a pump, wasn't there? There was a gas-operated pump that you'd hired, perhaps to pump water out from the basement, and that's what was blamed in the inquest. Can you tell me about that pump?
Yes, so when areas flood, there's usually, and storms, because there were storms, the first storms attributed to climate change ever. The electricity outage means that you can't use the electric pumps,
Sure.
and so you have to use petrol pumps. So many of our neighbours were using petrol pumps. Our house never had an electric outage, so we could continue using electric pumps. So we discovered years down the line, although during the inquest, there was an expert who said that the petrol pump that was at the rear of our home, just in case we needed it, could never run because it had a choke that was defective. And if it had been put on for any period of time, other than the period that we tested it to see if it would work, but if it was put on for any period of time, it wouldn't work. It would run lumpy and stop. So the petrol pump is immediately out of the picture.
So, how did you feel then at the inquest when they kept talking about this pump, which you didn't use? How did you feel about the whole raising of this defective pump?
This was an inquest where the jury was denied, legal aid representation was denied, witnesses and evidence was denied, public interest immunity was required, human rights investigations denied, victims were scapegoated and blamed. We had 6 organisations and public authorities represented by the best white collar crime QCs in the land, all funded for years by legal aid. Even the coroner had legal aid and additional legal QC representation. The coroner changed the day that my son died. My son, who I held in his arms until his fingers froze around me. And I'm not saying that to upset you, but to just share with you that I shared every moment of Zane's last hours. And the coroner said that my son died the day before, on the 7th of February. This was the kind of things that were coming out in the inquest. You can't make that up. The paramedics came, they tested Zane's body temperature. It was all normal on the 8th of February, and it documents how his temperature goes down over the time. And yet the coroner said my son died the whole day before. This was what we were dealing with at the inquest. You only have to scratch the surface and look at the evidence to see that the plausible deniability of a pump was just something else in the ether. There is far more controversial outcomes than just that pump.
So I'll just add that it was a complete misdirection.
Yeah.
And the terrible truth is that this is a child that died horribly when his home was infused with the nerve agent hydrogen cyanide.
It's like screaming in a forest for anyone to just sit and look at the facts with us, to just go through the piles and piles of, room full of evidence that we've got, and absolutely no evidence to ever say that pump was ever used, that pump could even work. There is just nothing. Even the fire brigade said the pump had never been used the moment that they came in.
Well, let's listen to what the Fire Brigade said, because Matt Rack's from the Fire Brigades Union and he has spoken out in support of you, and he's calling for the truth about Zane. Let's hear what he had to say.
On behalf of the union, I wanted to start by saying something about paying tribute to Zane's family, I think, who have shown an absolutely remarkable level of dignity, but also determination, because I think one thing that we find when we begin to ask questions sometimes is that it takes determination to see those questions through and to get to the answers. And in this case, as has been set out, there are questions which need to be answered which have not been answered. And how can we make changes? How can we make changes in relation to safety unless those demands for an inquiry are addressed? As a union, we have our own experiences of this, which I think colour our attitude to Zane's campaign. We deal with serious and risky incidents, as I'm sure everyone is aware. Our members attended this incident. Our members took evidence at this incident. Our members have evidence which is relevant to this case. And there is therefore a frustration that those questions have not been adequately addressed.
So that was Matt Rack from the Fire Brigades Union, and he was talking at a special event that you organised, which was to mark what would have been Zane's 16th birthday. He wasn't the only person to speak out in support. I know you've had the support of Green Party peer Baroness Natalie Bennett. Let's hear what she had to say when she addressed the House of Lords.
In 2014, a 7-year-old boy, Zane Gbangbola, went to sleep in his bed. He never woke up, and his father, sleeping nearby, has been forced to use a wheelchair since. The Fire Brigade Union, the PCS Union, and many other people, as his father Keir's doctors were convinced that Zane was poisoned by hydrogen cyanide gas that came from a landfill site nearby, carried by floodwaters. Now, before this tragic event, the Environment Agency had actually protected its own staff in a nearby building with a special membrane in the foundations to ensure there was no risk of an event like this. Now, as the Noble and Learned Lord said, the European Convention on Human Rights calls for an equality of arms in trials. There was no such equality at Zane's inquest. The weather that led to that flooding was linked to the climate emergency. Several years after this, Keir Gbangbola said, "We need to unlock the doors for the truth to come out." Had there been equality of arms at Zane's inquest, we might be much further down the road to getting a change in the law that we all need to keep us safe.
Now, it's so frustrating to you because there is a huge amount of evidence which indicates hydrogen cyanide was responsible for the death of your son. And it's interesting because at the beginning we were talking about this landfill site, which initially they denied there ever was a landfill site. But you've shown me previously the plans that prove that was there. How do you feel about these inconsistencies that keep coming up when you're calling for a public inquiry and there's kind of bogus information which is being put forward? How does that make you feel?
It seems that the misdirections were deliberately placed from day one. And what that does is disempower anybody that seeks to find the truth. And so you end up with complete dysfunction. The best way to example that is with things like Partygate and some of the other injustice cases with Partygate. If people don't tell the truth of what happened, how are people going to be able to investigate it and find out? This leads us to the simple conclusion that Zane needs a full and fearless, proper investigation of the facts, data and evidence surrounding how he died. And that's why you would have the independent panel inquiry with full disclosure. And that's how Hillsborough got the truth.
And I know you've had the support of the Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham. Let's hear what he had to say, because he sent such a strong video of support for you, and he is calling for a full investigation. Let's have a listen.
This is a message to confirm my 100% support for Keir and Nicole as they deliver the petition to 10 Downing Street on the occasion of their son's 16th birthday, calling for full disclosure and an independent panel inquiry into the death of their son, Zane. It has always been clear to me from the moment I first met them that the Gbangbola family have been victims of a serious injustice. How can a 7-year-old boy die in his own home, his dad left in a wheelchair, a home that had high readings of hydrogen cyanide, and there not be a full investigation into the circumstances as to how this happened? Keir and Nicole must have the truth about Zane. Natural justice demands it. Please, support Keir and Nicole, get behind the family, and let's all work together for truth about Zane.
Now, I contacted Spelthorne Borough Council and invited them to talk to me, or invited them to send a statement, and they've done neither. I also contacted the Cabinet Office, and I've not had any response at all to my inquiries. What do you make of that?
We had a petition with 117,000 signatures that we marched to Parliament and delivered 117,000 signatures for a public inquiry, and we've heard nothing. So I'm not surprised.
And I know that you're really in support of this Hillsborough law, actually. Explain to us what that is and how that might help as you search for the truth about Zane.
Zane will never win. We will never win. Zane has been taken from us. But if anything can come from this, if future deaths can be prevented, if families don't have to suffer a decade of fighting like we have, then we are all in support of a duty of candour, transparency, jail for those in authority that lie. Then we are in absolute full support of that. Something good will come from it.
And the Hillsborough law talks about having a public advocate, but remember, Hillsborough had to have their human rights returned to them before you could have the independent panel inquiry. So whilst any government, and Zane has his human rights removed, he cannot get the truth. So in the case of Hillsborough, there were 64 police statements that couldn't be investigated for their truth until people had their rights restored. Then you could have a full and fearless investigation around all of the evidence. So Zane will require that first, but in general, Hillsborough law is, as Nicole said, about making sure that there's parity of arms, and as Nicole outlined, we had none. We were quite literally a naked David against an army of Goliaths with weapons full to the brim, bombarding us whilst we were absolutely naked. Hillsborough law also brings in a public advocate, which is where you have expertise that ensures that evidence is collected properly to assist people in their justice cases. There is also the issue of candour, which means people must tell the truth. And if your boss or anybody asks you to lie, you can, within the law, say that I'm afraid I can't do that. We have to tell the truth. So Hillsborough law, duty of candour, is very significant. Plus, if anybody is found to not be telling the truth, they would be criminalised. So Hillsborough law is significant in justice cases, but until Zane has his human rights restored by way of an independent panel inquiry, our time is spent well in supporting such things.
Do you think you'll ever see a public inquiry? I mean, you've been denied it under these Tory governments. If there was a change of government, do you think, if the Labour Party came into power, do you think you might see a public inquiry then?
Zane is in the Labour Party manifesto as one of the burning injustices of our time. Of course, Zane was a child, we must always remember, and it's not usually in the conscience of British people to do these sorts of things to children. So being in the manifesto, when the pendulum swings, we hope that Zane will have that opportunity, or we expect, as it's written, that Zane will have his independent panel inquiry.
Let's hear a clip from Keir Starmer, because I know he has spoken out about this.
This is such an important case on its own individual facts, and also because of what it exposes about the ability of our institutional mechanisms to get to the truth in critical cases. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Zane's parents a number of times when I was in the Shadow Home Office brief, but have stayed with them, notwithstanding I moved to Brexit, because I just think it's such an important issue. There are so many levels at which things need to change. It's hard to know where you start. You have the absolute tragedy of what happened on the facts and the emotional impact that has, and then you have the overlay of how the coroner's court works for people in this position, with the inequality of arms because of the legal aid restrictions, the very facts of people having to represent themselves and to, I remember we had this discussion, not only try to master expert evidence, but also the pure and difficult emotional exercise of going through what actually happened. And to have that without the proper sort of protection of a legal team is just incredible.
Jeremy Corbyn's spoken out in support of you and your campaign, and one of the things that he flagged up was the possibility of other similar secret landfill sites across the UK. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
So the family have been through the most unbelievable stress and grief. To lose a child is awful for everybody, but to lose a child in wholly preventable circumstances is even worse. And so the questions then are asked, how did that pollution take place? How did that poisoning take place? Was there a military dump alongside it where former chemical weapons had been dropped or deposited rather? And how many more sites are there around the country protected by Official Secrets Act, protected by the blanket cloak of the Department of Defence that doesn't want to talk about where they've placed their very, very dangerous waste anywhere around the country? And so in campaigning for Zane's Law, what we're doing is campaigning for the truth about the dangers that so many communities face and do not realise it. They do not know where this stuff is. They do not know where it's dropped. They do not know what watercourses it is polluting and what effect that will have. I don't want there ever to be another Zane death in this country.
What do you think then about what Jeremy Corbyn said there about the possibility of similar sites in the UK?
We are aware from the British Medical Journal that 80% of people in this country live within 2 kilometres of landfill, and their studies show well in excess of 35,000 landfills across the country. And we are also aware that there was dumping that occurred in unregulated landfill. So there is a concern across the country as the climate changes that there will be more harm being done to people than the flooding itself. And this is the story of everyone that hears about Zane. What happened could have happened to any one of them. It's just we didn't know about the landfill, like many people do not know about the landfill.
Flooding is becoming an annual event, and you only have to put these landfill maps over the top of the flooding maps to see that there is that there's a potential of this happening again.
And that's the reason why Natalie Bennett has pursued Zane's law in a bid to protect the people of this country, much as other developed countries have such laws that protect them. That means that if a community is harmed by living in proximity to dangerous land, then that land, they can rest assured, will be dealt with and cleaned in the interests of that community.
We've talked a lot about what happened to Zane, but can you tell me what Zane was like?
You can see Zane over our shoulder. Zane was a beautiful 7-year-old boy. He was very bright. He read at the age of a 16-year-old when he was 6. But he also was very talented. He was a black belt taekwondo leader. To give you an idea, before Zane did a grading, and there weren't enough belts. So Zane specifically asked if he could give his belt to the young girl next to him, and he said, "I'll collect mine later." Zane never collected that belt.
Go posthumously.
So he's a very kind young boy. He liked to help people, raise a lot of money for charities. And Zane was also a little environmental activist. He was a young science, technology, engineering and maths ambassador. He went to a very good school. And Zane said that people believe sustainability and being green. And he's articled for this. This was in an article that was written. He was interviewed, much as you're interviewing us. And he said that people think sustainability and being green is about looking after their gardens, but it's about looking after an even bigger garden, one that belongs to the whole of the world.
With all of these campaigns, there's a number, Hillsborough 97, Justice for the 21. But with Zane, he was just a number one to the world, just one person that died. But to us, he was the world, and we built our world around him. There's no greater love. And when he passed, prayed for days that I wouldn't survive, but I did. And we have to know that we've survived for a reason, and then it's to undo the lies that they dishonour our son, and to make sure that he will forever rest in peace and that this will never happen again. Zane had more integrity than any of the people that we have come across, and that they have kicked his death into the long grass, but we are here to make sure that his voice is heard. He may have only walked this earth for a few years, but his voice will be heard, and we will get the truth about Zane. If it takes a lifetime of fighting, we're 10 years in and we're strong. We've lost everything. We've faced our greatest fear, and it's not until you've reached the bottom that you realise your true strength. You've nothing to lose, and we will ensure that Zane gets the truth.
We are 10 years in, and we've asked every Prime Minister, just tell the truth. If this had have happened to your children, you'd have had truth. Why not give our child the truth?
Thank you so much for sharing the story about Zane and for telling us what this beautiful little boy was like. And I think you're so fearless, and you've got my utmost respect, because you've been through the worst thing that any parent can ever go through. Thank you so much for talking to me today about your fight for the truth about Zane. I'm journalist Angela Walker, and today I've been in conversation with Zane Gbangbola and Nicole Lawler as they search for the truth about Zane. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. Please do subscribe and follow, because that means, due to the algorithms, more people will get to listen to this podcast. And if you'd like more information, check out my website, angelawalkerreports.com. Until next time, take care.